Scene: a cozy living room. A religious man sips his coffee and lights a cigar. He seems at ease. The camera focuses on you, sitting nearby, with a decaf drink in hand, reflecting on the contrast between your choice and his. Well, here we are, watching a very religious man sip his coffee, light up a cigar, and go about his day with what seems like complete comfort. Meanwhile, I'm sitting here with my decaf, aware of my body's response to substances like caffeine. I know the high-test version would send me bouncing off the walls, especially with my, other issues, health problems. I even have to settle for decaf espresso to keep it in check, right? Lower caffeine. Last night I had green tea, and for the first time I felt like I was on amphetamines. Well, I wouldn't have put it that way. I apologize, scripting error there. It's funny, isn't it? I take caffeine in small doses, it hits me like a freight train, but actually that's not the way I would have explained it. What I explained is we treat some chemicals as if we were going to be exposed by it for the first time and in large quantities without being weaned into it, right? Kind of like how people misunderstand reading a book, right? You don't give a kid an encyclopedia and he starts reading it and understanding it, right? We don't introduce alcohol to our children by getting them drunk. Right? We usually work our way into these things, and I wonder if we'd pay attention the first time we've had a cigar or a cigarette. You can imagine, even if you haven't, you can imagine the impact that might be the first time. Same as alcohol. The first time you ever had it, instead of just as we sometimes do, sip and then have a little bit more and then maybe a little bit more. The first time you had alcohol, if you had gotten blind drunk, your experience would be a little bit different. And I know this for a fact, because how many people do you know who got really blind, rip-roaring drunk on, say, a particular, right, on vodka or rum, right? And they swore off that particular brand of booze because of that. But there's your example. So imagine if we were to treat all of these compounds in the same way, right? Tobacco. And so we'll go on with the script here, but that's what I was trying to get across, this idea of how we treat these compounds differently, right? So I'll actually read what we went through here. I was actually looking at the differences in society between smoking and cannabis use. And the numbers it came up with was surprising because it gave, well, here's what I wrote. And the numbers came out 14% smoking in the U.S., but it didn't mention what they consider a smoker, right? Is that a daily or somewhat daily? But then it mentioned 18 to 20% report using cannabis in the last year, but regular use, defined as daily or near daily, is estimated to be around 8 to 9%. Well, that is so close in my opinion. But then I thought, well, what about vaping? That kind of throws a little wrench in the works there as to what is smoking. I personally wouldn't probably lump vaping in with smoking, but if you're looking at nicotine use, then you would, right? Because smoking cannabis and vaping cannabis is essentially the same because we're looking at the consumption of the THC. So I asked, what about the vaping? And I asked about a slant in the numbers, because the difference between the two, tobacco and cannabis, and I mean even caffeine. I mean, I don't even know what the numbers would be for caffeine use. It's probably 100%. Defining regular use, as I said, was an issue. But this slant in perception between nicotine and cannabis and caffeine, right? And the only compound in that mix that has healing potential, true healing potential. Right? Even ran it through the AI, and I won't go through the whole silly little idea, but its final thoughts were that your reflection highlights the tension between biological reality and cultural perception. We need to continue questioning why we treat some substances as harmless or even essential, right? Caffeine, nicotine, or worse, while demonizing others. Right? And the list is long, but we're just talking about cannabis, for example, because there's a whole discussion to be had here. But despite the fact that cannabis may offer more in terms of healing potential and align more closely with our natural biology, This slant is one of many contradictions in how substances are viewed in our society. But I think none is worse than this, right? Because I live in a country that we still think that we need to paternalize everything, right? So we have a liquor control board, and we have what's called a beer store. And until recently, you could only buy your alcohol at these approved outlets. And the history is you used to have specific permission to be able to buy booze. Imagine. But now you can buy as much as you want. You can fill a truckload full. The only reason why they want to know why you're buying so much is, believe it or not, if you're buying it for resale, that's fine. They just charge you more money for the same product. Imagine. You're buying it in bulk. Hey, we're going to have to charge you extra. But at the same time, when they supposedly legalized cannabis, they came out with a retail infrastructure that limits how much you can purchase at any one time, limits the strength, limits the quantity, and your possession limit, all while there is no LD50 for cannabis. There is no number known that will kill you. The only way, arguably it's a joke, but the only way that cannabis could be fatal is if they dropped a 2-ton bale of it on you. Ha ha ha. But alcohol is completely different, right? You could purchase in one container enough alcohol to kill somebody, but there is no container large enough to do the same with the other compound. Same with caffeine, nicotine. I mean, these compounds can be used to euthanize living beings, but not cannabis. But what I'm trying to get at here is, we have done something weird like in no other place. We have caffeine vending machines at every corner. But our cannabis industry has actually ruined the healing potential of this medicine with its combination of doing a terrible job with the product itself, not keeping it clean, ignoring the medical side completely. But worse yet, just their retail practices and just their understanding of the product. I liken it to much worse, but to beer when they started to push IPAs to everybody, and they made the perception of craft beer IPA. They ruined it, right? Because I love Pilsners, and I love I love all sorts of different types of beers, Belgians, Abbey ales, wonderful dark beers, wonderful light beers. But what they went is they pushed arguably something that was an extreme version, and they turned people off, right? Because really, they oversimplify things. McGilchrist talks about this and calls it flattening. I call it our addiction to the absurd. That we make everything so simple to the point where it's just stupid and it doesn't even make sense anymore, and it doesn't even apply to what we're looking at, right? So if the idea was to get people drinking more craft beer and less of this industrialized craps, right? Well, you're not going to push them something that is the extreme. Like I said, that's like trying to teach kids to read with Hegel, right? Some sort of philosophy tome rather than C-Spot Run. Right. The same could be said as now we have booktubers that are reading young adult fiction into their 60s. That's the same problem, only in reverse. But so a problem here, it's not just perception, it's actually active destruction of something with great potential. You see what I mean? Even the AI here is saying, oh, well, it's just, society. It's not just societal perception here. This is an active denial of one truth for the embracing of something that is arguably a lie, right? So this all started because I'm watching a video of a gentleman do a small little Bible study, which is cool. But he's sitting there drinking a coffee and smoking a cigar and, criticizing others for their choices in personal drugs. And so I'll continue on with the script, but I digress, but I think that's what I do best. So let's take nicotine, right? The first time you try it, it feels like a punishment, doesn't it? It's harsh, makes you dizzy and uncomfortable. Your fingers tingle, and yet we treat caffeine and nicotine as perfectly fine. No one raises an eyebrow when someone has a cup of coffee or smokes a cigar. And remember, we have caffeine in pop that we feed even to little kids. It's ingrained in our culture, but cannabis? That's dangerous. That's a substance we've been taught to fear. It's a weird slant here, don't you think? Especially with our endocannabinoid system, that those little kids that are being fed the caffeine, no one bats an eye. But when I tell the story that when I was a kid, I was fed pickles and lemon slices and stuff like that, and people are like, oh my gosh, imagine, like, that just, was a short experience. Whereas caffeine was, probably an all day long. I digress. That being said, that same child is sitting there producing their own anandamide, which is your endocannabinoid. It's beyond the pale. But let's proceed. So we cut to a visual comparison. A steaming coffee cup on one side and, well, a hash pipe with some wonderful, fluffy, natural, organic hash in the bowl. Why is nicotine, which is highly addictive and has known long-term health risks like cancer and heart disease, so culturally accepted, even in religious circles? It's ritualized. It's normalized. You can be having a cigar with your coffee and no one bats an eye. But when it comes to cannabis, which has real medical potential, cannabinoids, the script has THC and CBD. I argue some of the most potential are these low-frequency compounds and some of the hundreds of other cannabinoids that we don't talk about. Again, our addiction to simplifying the world. Many of these compounds may potentially be used to manage chronic pain, which we have very little other options for in society. Reduce anxiety. That might be, we've seen recently a meta-survey that showed that selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, haven't been helping people. Lustig in his book, The Emperor Has a New Drug? He may have been right. We put our faith in one boat, and that boat went down. Right? So let's not go down with the boat and realize that maybe we need something else to take the edge off as people, and I recommend the book Brain Energy, as people learn that our mental health, our anxiety, chronic pain, maybe even epilepsy, maybe even cancer may be tied to inflammation, which may be tied to metabolism, metabolic issues, maybe even mitochondrial issues. But that's a different string you can pull on a different day, right? But we see this compound with so much potential as possibly dangerous. Really? Is that fair? We haven't even talked about its connection to our own internal, well, I have recently, but anyway, we haven't gone into deeply the endocannabinoid system, something our bodies produce. I think we've even learned that just about every organism on the planet has one. I think they even discovered it in insects. Yet this substance we've made illegal for decades. We treat it like it's a gateway to something sinister. Right? If you look at the data, it's things like smoking and drinking that are the true gateway drugs, yet those are legal and possibly even encouraged when we have advertisements. Caffeine and nicotine, two substances that impact our nervous systems, our energy levels, and our concentration, our very being. Sure, caffeine gives you a buzz. It's a stimulant just like nicotine, but we've normalized them. We've made them part of our daily rituals. We even take massive doses like it's a game. But both can have very serious negative side effects. Too much caffeine, anxiety, insomnia, jittering, even worse, heart issues. Nicotine, addiction, heart disease, lung cancer, and everything that we said before. Yet, when you mention cannabis, people absolutely flip out. It's been made into this societal boogeyman, and that's what it was. I mean, there's a book called Reefer Madness. And it's become almost like a Jungian archetype that is completely invisible to the conscious. And we call it fate when it controls our lives. It's strange. What makes nicotine and cannabis okay, but cannabis bad? Both are drugs. Both impact our health. But the way we talk about them is night and day. And what about the fact that cannabis actually has potential therapeutic uses? It's a plant that produces compounds we already have in our bodies. Cannabis is more in line with our biology than nicotine or caffeine. It's not some foreign invader. It interacts with our very physiology. Yet, we've made it the villain. Right? Cut to a scientific diagram of our endocannabinoid system, something that we've only just begun to understand. Cannabis is more than just a substance. It's a part of our own biology. We've been working with our endocannabinoid system for eons, yet we're only just beginning to understand it. THC, CBD, these are naturally occurring compounds that mimic our body's own cannabinoids. Our body responds to them, not with harm, but with healing potential, almost essential. The French government tried to develop a drug that would turn off this system, and it led to deaths. Imagine, cannabis. The only way that it can cause fatalities is if we try to synthesize it or mess with our natural system. Our body responds to these compounds. Right? So why this slant? Why this double standard? Now the scene cuts back to me, sitting with my decaf drink, thoughtfully looking at the coffee and cigar with you know what in my hand. I don't have the answers, but it's clear something's off. Nicotine and caffeine are part of the mainstream, while cannabis is still treated, maybe not completely with suspicion, even though it may have far more to offer us. In fact, cannabis may even align more closely with our bodies and our biology than the substances we're so comfortable with. We're quick to call cannabis dangerous, but we overlook the potential harm in our socially acceptable habits that come at our own risks. Why is there such a disconnect? Maybe it's time we start asking why we treat substances this way. Maybe it's time we look beyond the slant.